to tell you a little bit about myself, I always loved music. I was good at music. I played piano and flute through school, and went on to do a Bachelor of Arts at Sydney University, where they had a good music school. At that time, the Conservatorium wasn't amalgamated with Sydney University, and so I did a Bachelor of Arts with majors in music and English. Just to keep going on the education side of things, following that I did the grad dip in arts management at UTS, which at the time I did it, I think I started in about 1991, something like that. It was only the second year that it was being run, and you only could do a grad dip at that stage. There was no masters and no certificate, and it was out at Ku-ring-gai, so that's where it was based. And for me, I was very new in my career in arts management, and I really felt that it gave me a lot of contacts and a lot of confidence. They were the main things. I mean, that was, a million years ago, and Excel was brand new. I remember being given lessons in how to use Excel and how to use spreadsheets. That's how kind of long ago it was. So it was quite a hands-on practical course. But for me, it did give me a lot of contacts because a lot of the people doing the course were more established in their careers than I was. So that was a really fantastic thing. A few years later, I went on to do a Masters in Policy at UNSW, and although that was very theoretical, and I was the only person working in the arts doing that course, it did give me some really good background for parts of my career that came up later, particularly when I was working for the Australian Council, which is the government's arts funding body. After that, I've done a grad certificate in applied finance because that has become part of what's become very important in my day-to-day role. And I'm also a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, which will become relevant in a moment. So in terms of my career, after I graduated from university, I fairly quickly fell into a job at the Australian Council as an administration assistant in the Visual Arts Craft Board. I was there for 4 years and given a lot of opportunities there to do sort of what they call hard duties and to get experience doing slightly higher level roles within the Australian Council. I learned a lot about arts policy and about the funding process basically, which stood me in very, very good stead. But the visual arts area really wasn't where my heart lay, and it certainly wasn't my area of expertise. And so I realised pretty quickly that I had to get out in what they termed, from within that bureaucracy, we termed the field. And for me, I wanted to go back into the music world, and so I was fortunate to get a job as general manager of what was then the Sydney Children's Choir and is now Gondwana Choirs, which incorporates the Sydney Children's Choir, but also the National Children's Choir and the National Indigenous Children's Choir, so it's quite a large organisation now. And I did that for a couple of years. I then went on to be the artistic administrator at the Australian Youth Orchestra, and so I was starting to get experience in orchestras and touring, working with young people, and all the things that entails. I moved from there to Symphony Australia as the Artist Development Manager, and I worked implementing programs that were to assist conductors, composers and performers. I did that for about 8 years. I had my 2 children while I was doing that job, and I was studying during that time as well. Then I went back to the Australian Council, so kind of moved, you tend to move in and out of jobs a lot in the arts. This time as the director of the music board, which was a much, much higher level position than I had been as an admin assistant when I first started in that organisation. And that was where I really started to rely on that Masters in Policy, and I started to really need that kind of foundation and those academic skills, I guess. The Australian Council is very much to do with providing policy and guidance and advice really to the government, and so there was a lot of working with the federal government at that time, and also with the state arts funding authorities as well, but in a national kind of way. And that time at the Australian Council totally broadened my horizons. So instead of just working in classical music, I was now working in jazz, pop, hip hop, folk music, classical music, every kind of music was covered by the music board. So for me, that was a real eye-opener. It taught me to be much more open-minded about music, which has been a good thing since Vince came along, because his taste in music is very, very different to mine. But it's taught me that, excellence is excellence, regardless of what the genre is. So I spent 5 years there, and then I went back again to Symphony Australia, so twice at the Australia Council, twice at Symphony Australia. And at Symphony Australia, before we move on to that, at Symphony Australia I became CEO, and it was during a time of some expansion at that company, so we rebranded to be Symphony Services International. Now, the way Symphony Australia works is that it's a service organisation. It's not really what you would call a peak body. So Linda has suggested that you guys might be interested in peak bodies, and I'll talk about that a little more. Symphony Australia functions in some ways like a peak body. We do represent our members. We only have 6 members, and that's the 6 symphony orchestras from around the country. The history of the organisation is that those 6 orchestras were broadcast orchestras with the ABC from the 1930s. And then in the late 1970s, they devolved to become individual companies. So they got their own boards, their own staff. A whole lot of things happened for them. They started needing to raise their own funds. They became independent, basically, and they've grown enormously in the decades since they corporatised. Because we're so far away from the rest of the world, and because almost all of the conductors and soloists that feature with those orchestras come from overseas, there were still some services that were more economical to provide nationally and centrally. And that's why Symphony Australia was created. So we used to be what was called the concert music division of the ABC. The 6 orchestras corporatised, and that concert music division corporatised as well and became Symphony Australia. And over the years, what we have done has changed a little bit, but essentially now the services that we provide are that artist development program that I mentioned, which runs the Young Performers Awards and a big conductor training program, various opportunities for composers. We bring in all of the international artists, so we do all of their visas, their travel, their contracts, their payments, we get their TFNs and ABNs, so we kind of do everything that's centralised and do their flights and their accommodation and so on. We have a massive music library which actually provides the scores and parts to the orchestras to play from. Most of the orchestras have their own libraries as well, but the biggest part of the library belongs to us, and we inherited that collection from the ABC. It's worth about $8 million, so it's a really big collection of music, which is housed in our offices. And then the 4th service that we provide is program notes. So when you open up your program and read about the music that you're listening to in the concert hall, we've got a central repository of those program notes, and we're adding to those all the time, commissioning new notes and so on. And the nature of program notes has changed enormously over the years, so we're having to kind of refresh that collection all the time. And then a new service that has recently been added is advocacy, and we are now providing some advocacy, but particularly coordination of advocacy on behalf of the orchestras. So that's helping them to make their case to government, in particular to the federal government, about why orchestras are important, what they bring to society, why they should continue to be funded, why in fact they should receive additional funding, and we'll talk about funding a little bit more in a while. So Symphony Australia's role essentially is to provide those services rather than being an umbrella organisation that kind of looks down. We're a service organisation that looks up to our clients. In addition to those 6 members who all pay us a service level fee, and it's identical. So regardless of whether they're the tiny little TSO, which has 47 players and is essentially a chamber music organisation, or whether it's the Sydney Symphony with 110 players and masses of funds and so forth, they all pay the same to us. There's a long history as to why that is, and there's a lot of argument and discussion about whether it should be so, but that's how it is at the moment. So the international aspect of the new branding, Symphony Services International, by the way, there are orchestras, sorry, should have done that, I'm not on top of my slides. The international aspect is that we now sell some of our services to anyone who wants them. So any orchestra from overseas might say to us, well, we want to purchase your program notes, or we want to hire the music that you have in your collection. We have a publishing arm, so they might want to purchase the music that we've published. So a number of the services that we provide, we now provide internationally. Most of the time to probably Asia and New Zealand, just because of their proximity, but some of the time to America and Europe as well. We've also developed a product which is a WHS product for musicians. It's called the Good Ear Acoustic Shield, and it's a wraparound personal hearing protection device, and that's been massively popular, particularly in Europe and the UK, where they've introduced legislation which says that employers have to protect the hearing of their employees. So that's Symphony Australia. Now the other organisation which really kind of is a peak body is AMPAG, and that's the Australian Major Performing Arts Group. Now, forgive me if I'm telling you stuff that you already know, but within the Australia Council, the organisation's funding is split into the small to medium sector and the major sector. The major sector is the 28 companies which cross theatre, dance and music. In the music area, well actually, here you go, that's them. So in the music area, it's the orchestras, it's the two major, or it's actually all the state opera companies and the National Opera Company. It's the state theatre companies, and it's some of the major dance organisations, Musica Viva, so that's them there. Now, the small to medium sector, on the other hand, is made up of kind of everybody else, and you will probably be aware of the furor that's going on in the arts community over the changes that the Arts Minister, Senator Brandis, who's also the Attorney General, has introduced to the budget. This will give you an idea of why that's important. So this is the 2013, this is from the annual report of the Australia Council. And what you can see there is that the orchestras, which is, it's actually 8 companies because it's the 6 symphony orchestras plus the 2 pit orchestras, Orchestra Victoria and, what's the other one? Oh, AOB, sorry, Australian Opera and Ballet Orchestra. Chew up $55.8 million of the almost $200 million total. So that's a lot of money. If you add in the opera companies, you know, and the other major performing arts companies, you actually get 51% of the total Australia Council budget going to 28 companies, which leaves 49% for hundreds of small to medium organisations and individual artists. So think about that for a minute. Just going back to that previous slide, even if you look at the chunk, the 51% that goes to the major organisations, 55.8 million of that, so again, the largest part of the chunk is going to orchestras. So they're actually really, really well funded in a sense. I mean, they would argue that, of course, they need more. But in a global sense also, they're very well funded. So there are countries in the world, particularly in Europe, that are probably better funded, to get more government support as a proportion of their income than in Australia. But actually in Australia, we are in an enviable position compared to many, many countries in the world. Are there any questions about those two diagrams? So you can see there $102.2 million goes to the major performing arts companies, $22.8 million goes to the key orgs. Now that's across all art forms. So that's across music, theatre, dance, literature, Indigenous arts, cross art form stuff, experimental stuff, I mean everything. That's 22.8 million.
What constitutes being a key organisation?
Okay, so this is all going to change because the Australia Council has now just been stripped of a huge amount of money, and I'll explain that. But a key organisation is essentially a recurrently funded organisation within, it's just a categorisation within the Australia Council. So it's a kind of a safety net. It means that your company knows that it's in the favoured few, if you like, that it has basically the same amount of money. It goes up a little bit with indexation, but it's essentially the same amount of money each year for the number of years, which is usually a 3-year term. It also usually means that they're funded by their state funding authority as well. So if you're based in New South Wales, chances are you're probably getting about half your grant income from the Australia Council and about half from Arts New South Wales. It's a mark of approval in a sense. It's hugely competitive.
And do those companies put forward those?
Yep. So they put forward a strategic plan, which is usually a 3-year strategic plan. So actually, one thing I meant to tell you in my introduction is that in addition to working for the major sector with Symphony Australia, I'm also the chair of a couple of companies in the small to medium sector. So I'm currently the chair of Gondwana Choirs. I've just finished being the chair of Ensemble Offspring, which is a really small kind of micro organisation, and I'm also on the board of Accessible Arts. So I'm kind of hooked into the small to medium sector as well. Ensemble Offspring is a really good example. fabulous company. It's existed for 25 years, I think. Really tiny, so small that it's never even had any staff. The artistic directors haven't gotten paid. You know, it's your typical kind of arts organisation getting by on the smell of an oily rag. When I came on as chair, we had an absolute aspiration to become a key organisation. So this was before anyone had dreamed up George Brandis's cuts to the budget. And we worked really, really hard to put together a business plan, to put together the budgets, to prove that we could be financially viable, to prove that we're artistically excellent, all the things that you have to do to prove that we had a board in place that was taking care of the governance side of things. And hey, we got it. We were the first organisation that had broken into that key orgs funding in many years. It was fantastic. And their grant suddenly went from $50,000 to $150,000 a year by making that step. So it was really worthwhile. Now it's all up in the air again because of the changes that have come through. So I might actually just talk about those changes in a minute. This is a picture of, I think it's the QSO on the top. It's one of the symphony orchestras and Ensemble Offspring, part of Ensemble Offspring on the bottom. So, you know, huge symphony orchestra, beautiful little small ensemble. They're very different, but they're both making excellent product. They're both making fantastic music, and they're both respected within their parts of the sector. So the small to medium sector is really important to the major sector, and more so possibly in the theatre area than in music, but nevertheless in music. So you have companies like Gondwana Choirs performs with the Sydney Symphony all the time. If Sydney Symphony needs children's choir, they go to Sydney Children's Choir. If they need an adult choir, they go to Sydney Philharmonic Choirs, another key organisation. You know, there are often personnel who are coming through those smaller organisations who then go on to play in the orchestras or to work for the orchestras in the marketing department or in publicity or whatever it happens to be, finance. They're training grounds for the major organisations, and they're all part of an ecology. They all need each other. There's not a lot of sharing of audiences, but there is some, I think. And so what has happened with this funding situation is that the current Arts Minister, George Brandis, decided, pretty much without any consultation with anyone in the sector, that he would remove $100 million over 4 years from the Australia Council budget and put it into his own grant process, which is going to be managed by the Federal Department of the Arts, so down in Canberra. And it's called the National Program for Excellence in the Arts. And this just all got announced with the most recent budget and just happened like that. The Australian Council had no inkling of it, the sector had no inkling of it. The problem with it, the major organisations had long been advocating for assistance with endowments and matching philanthropy. So they wanted, if they got a big grant or big donation from someone, they wanted government to match that. They have long been looking for better assistance for international touring because it costs billions to tour an orchestra overseas, but it's a really important thing to do, and the government really values it in terms of cultural diplomacy. They wanted assistance with regional touring because it's incredibly expensive to tour an orchestra to the regions in Australia, which, as you know, are just so far away and so inaccessible and so difficult to get to, and yet those people are also audiences of the, Adelaide Symphony Orchestra or Queensland Symphony Orchestra. So there were areas that the orchestras had been advocating for a long time that they would like additional assistance from the government in. George Brandis has given them that, but in doing so, instead of giving new money, he's taken it from the Australia Council, which of course wasn't what anybody really intended. And what he's done is he has said that the guidelines have come out recently, and technically the small to medium sector is actually able to apply for that money. However, a lot of the small to medium sector, for instance, doesn't tour internationally. It can't afford to. It doesn't necessarily have access to the big donors, so it's going to be hard to match philanthropic giving. It doesn't necessarily have endowments in place, so that's not going to be useful to it. So a lot of the small and medium sector is saying, well, hang on a second, you've taken this money out of the Australia Council. They have quarantined the major performing arts funding, so the grants, the base grants, that $102.2 million is safe. It's not going to be touched. So the $100 million over 4 years is going to come out of the rest of it. Well, it's not going to leave very much, is it? So that is what everybody is very, very upset about. And the small and medium sector has really kind of mobilised over this whole thing and has come together. There have been a lot of rallies. You might have heard of Free the Arts, which has been quite vocal lately. A lot of companies are thinking fast as to how they might be able to access some of the money in the NPEA. And for instance, Gondwana Choirs, which I'm involved with, okay, we tour all the time internationally. Every year there's at least one international tour of one group or other of the choirs. We tour regionally, and in fact we're national, so we're taking kids from regions all the time. The Indigenous Children's Choir is based up in Cairns, brings children in from all over Torres Strait, all over the Gulf, all kinds of parts of Australia that are quite remote and regional. We do have quite a good donor base, so we may be able to get some assistance there. So we're scrambling to kind of figure out what can we get, how can we get it, and we assume George Brandis has never heard of us. He's probably never heard of Gondwana Choirs. So it's our job to tell him so that he understands that we're as excellent as the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. In fact, we're the choir of choice of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. Now that's our job as the board and the staff of the organisation. And that's really what all of the small to medium organisations are going to have to do. Individuals are completely cut out of it. They're not in those guidelines at all. So funding to individuals through the federal government's funding agency is going to be really slashed to pieces. So that's a very, very big issue that's going on at the moment in the arts sector. Have you guys talked about that at all? Are you across this issue? Yeah, a bit? Yeah. There's a lot on social media and what have you. Okie doke. Where am I up to? So, all right. So that's enough on that. I'm really happy to answer questions on that, but let's move on. You're all looking for careers in the arts, and as we promoted, very different areas, very different art forms, very different aspirations and plans. These are just some of the areas where people can get jobs in the classical music sector, but a lot of them will actually cross over into other art forms as well. So all art forms really need operations of some kind or another. Education and learning is just huge now, and any organisation that really wants serious funding is going to have to address those areas. So they're areas that are going to be really staffed up and cashed up in the future. Sales and marketing obviously is the lifeblood of any performing arts organisation. Development is becoming more and more and more important. And the orchestras, you'd think, they've got 4, 5 or 6 staff working in this area, but they're still looking to learn. And my company funds professional development grants for the staff of the orchestras to go overseas and do whatever. Almost all of the applications are from people in the development area wanting to go to America, because that's where you go. That's where they do it so well. It's set up incredibly well, and they've got a history and a culture of giving in the United States. So we learn from the orchestras in the United States all the time, and in fact we're having a big orchestral summit later this year in November, and we're bringing a woman called Russell Willis-Taylor out to Australia. She's fantastic. She used to run the English National Opera. She's American, but she has a huge background in philanthropy and development and giving, and so she's coming out to talk to us about that. External or government relations is becoming more and more of an area. It's more and more of a thing. And I guess it's that reflection that I just had of George Brandis going Gondwana what? We can't afford external or government relations staff. So the board has to take on that role. Having a relationship with not only the minister, but the minister's advisors, the minister's key staff, the opposition, because the Liberals aren't going to be in power forever. You've got to be friends with everybody. You've got to understand how to advocate. You've got to understand how Canberra works. And you've got to work with politicians instead of working against them. So those sorts of roles are becoming more and more important in the arts scene. And then, of course, there's the kind of support roles like HR, IR, finance and IT, which any company needs. So, there's kind of lots of options there. And my philosophy always was to get as much experience in as many areas as I can, because, first of all, I'm going to find something that I enjoy doing, but also something that I'm good at. and I'm going to always kind of understand what other people's jobs are, and I think that that's really important. So my advice to all of you would be get as much experience as you possibly can in as many areas as you possibly can, because it will stand you in good stead. And crossing over art forms isn't a problem either. Working for a while in an art form that's not your own can open your eyes to completely different ways of thinking and doing things. And I always felt very kind of insecure working in the visual arts area because I hadn't studied fine arts. I didn't understand. It was that kind of horrible old cliche. I know what I like, but I learned so much, and I met people who were able to tell me about visual arts, and certainly it created a lifelong interest for me. Now, this slide is just about jobs, and I wanted to talk to you about jobs a little bit. So, more and more in Australia, employers are looking overseas. Now, that doesn't mean they're not looking in Australia, but it means they're also looking overseas, because 457 visas are not that hard to get. And surprisingly, people in places like particularly the UK are incredibly badly paid by comparison to Australians. So, someone living in the UK who's probably got a cost of living not dissimilar to Sydney might be being paid 2/3 of what someone doing a similar sort of job in Australia is doing. So you've got this huge number of people who are kind of thinking, well, gee, here I am in my 30s, I'm earning this amount of money, I could be earning quite substantially more in Australia and going to the beach every weekend. I think I'll put my hand up for that job. So, companies are actually looking beyond Australia for many roles, not entry-level roles because it's not worthwhile, but once you kind of get middle and above, I think they are looking for that. So it's becoming increasingly competitive. You're not just competing with your peers and Australians, but you're also competing with people you don't necessarily know. And unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate, overseas people are often attractive to employers just because they're not Australian. That's never been how I feel about it. In fact, I get quite angry about it because I think that we're investing a lot of money in training and providing experience and opportunities to Australians, and then we don't give them a job. It doesn't make sense to me. But I do see that out there, and you need to kind of be able to show that you've got local knowledge, which is valuable. That your local knowledge is worth more than that person just because they worked in England doesn't mean that they can do the job better than you can. In fact, you've got contacts and you know people and you understand how the government works and you understand how arts funding in Australia works. So find your point of difference and your point of value. Anyway, these were just a list of places that you can actually look for jobs in the arts world. I have to admit, a colleague of mine gave me a number of them. I'd never heard of some of the ones down the bottom there, which is, first of all, shows that I'm incredibly out of touch, and I will be using them from now on. But I think it also shows that often people of your generation are actually much more in touch than people perhaps of my generation. The trouble is it's my generation that's doing the hiring. So it wouldn't have really occurred to me to advertise in anything from probably the Loop down. Or in fact some of the ones above it too, the Vine, I've never heard of. We're all learning as we go along, but my newspapers are now almost hardly used at all, but my number one there, networking and word of mouth, is just absolutely always going to be the best way of getting a job, I believe. I know a lot of people volunteer or intern and do that sort of thing, and certainly that works. I've got a young fellow coming over from Perth at his own expense to live in Sydney for a couple of weeks, staying on people's couches so that he can do a couple of weeks of sort of work experience / interning with me. And I've set him up with Opera Australia and a couple of other companies. I mean, I don't know him, but he was so personable and enthusiastic and keen when he contacted me that I thought, oh, well, it's no skin off my nose to have him if he's willing to come at his own expense. And you never know what that might lead to, but it's good. So that works. Having champions really works too, because I ring around. I don't just trust the referees that I'm giving on a job application. If someone says that they've worked at the Australian Music Centre but they haven't put a referee from there, well, I'm going to ring John Davis, who's the director of the Australian Music Centre, and say, who's this person? Why aren't you there as a referee? What do you think of them? And everyone does that. So, you really need to, I think, always remember you're always doing a job interview, really, no matter who you're working with and what you're doing. you are actually setting yourself up for the next job, I think, and being friends with everybody is really worthwhile, and always doing your best. I mean, I'm sure you know all of this. But, if you can find a couple of champions who'll be your referees, and particularly if they're kind of well-known people in your sector, whoever those people might be, make sure that you ask them to do it for you. People will generally say yes if you ask them to help you. I've always found that, and I'll always say yes if people ask me, and I think most people are like that too. So don't be afraid to ask, and kind of pick carefully who it is that you want to have as your champions. Now, one other thing that I would recommend to you, if the opportunity ever presents itself, is being on board, because again, that gives you a whole other insight into how companies work. So I was first on the board of Sydney Children's Choir not long after I left as general manager of that organisation. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and didn't really learn all that much, because back then governance wasn't that much of a thing. But I've always worked to boards, so I've always had to, report to a board and write papers for boards and so on, and I've always been quite sort of intrigued with how they work, and particularly how chairmen's minds work. In recent years, I decided that this was an area that I'd really like to move into. So at the moment, I'm a full-time employee with several volunteer roles on boards and a mum and all of those sorts of things. But there will come a time when I would really like to make boards my career. I'd like to be on paid boards, and that's what I would see myself moving into. So I set myself the task of learning how to do it really well. Part of that is by being on boards and by contributing and listening and learning, particularly if you've got a really good chairman. And I use that as a gender-neutral term. Part of it is through actual education. So I did the AICD Company Directors course, which is massively expensive, but so worth doing if you can convince somebody else to pay for it, which I did. My company paid for it. And by the way, I would always recommend, particularly if you're in a sort of institutional type company, ask them to help you if you're studying. So my company paid for my graduate diploma in arts management, and I'm pretty sure the company I was with at the time paid half of my master's fees, and my current company paid for my ASCD course. Now, all of that came under sort of professional development or training. Most of those bigger companies have got a budget for doing that. Smaller ones obviously don't, but they might give you the time off to study, for instance. You might have to come up with fees, and they'll give you some time to do it. So, ask your employer to help you, because they want you to be as educated as you possibly can. So back to being on the board. So the AICD course is really good, and even if you can't afford to do the company directors course, there are lots of smaller courses that you can do, and there are other places like the Governance Institute. There's loads of places that you can do training in being on a board, and it really does give you a completely different perspective. It's much more about strategy, it's about risk management, it's about leadership. There are different skills that you learn by being on a board, and it's great fun. So I would recommend that to you if you get the chance.